We have posted today. In particular, we're going to be talking about a couple of book interviews in the next couple of hours. Abdu Murray has been with us before, and we've talked about his book on Islam. That would certainly be important, but we have scheduled for him to speak on his new book, Saving Truth, Finding Meaning and Clarity in the Post-Truth World. We did have one conversation with him many months ago, but we thought it would be good to come back to that again. Tremper Longman will be with us, and we'll be talking about his book, The Bible and the Ballot, Using Scripture in Political Decisions. And he also has a new book out also on some of the Old Testament issues, so that is the case. By the way, for those of you that are actually significant donors to Point of View, we always send booklets out. One coming out soon is one I just got today. So it'll be a while before you get it, but it's on Islam and certainly relevant to some of the conversation we just had a minute ago. So, by the way, speaking of donations, I will make a greater announcement about this in the next hour. I just found out from our President Warren Kelly that we were able to meet the match. We had one match that was about $100,000. We've been able to meet that so far. And then we have, as you might remember, a match that went into about $150,000. So with the money coming in from the mail, if this is typical and to what has happened last year, we'll be real close. So again, if you have been wondering about that, we are coming very close to meeting that match. And that is a real encouragement because that helps us finish the year of 2019 in the black. There are a few pieces of equipment, by the way, that we think we need to purchase, and so that will be helpful as well. So I just want to say thank you if you've actually given. And, of course, as we get into the year 2020, I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support us on a regular basis. But let's get back to one of the articles I posted. And this is a good example of something I sort of have sat on for a while until there was maybe a better piece. If you are at all out on the Internet, and especially on Facebook, you've heard of this one individual who was sentenced to 16 years in prison because he stole a gay rainbow flag and burned it in front of a strip club. And you said, wait a minute, that doesn't even sound right. Well, now we have a little more of the history, but I think it illustrates again as a broader issue rather than just his particular incident, this whole idea of hate crimes as why they are such a bad idea, because hate crimes basically become thought crimes. And I think this particular piece by Myron Magnet is really well done. So I posted it here. It is by Wall Street Journal. And in some respects, if you don't subscribe to the Wall Street Journal as I do, you could go out on the Internet and not have a chance to read it in its entirety, so I have posted it here for you today. And I'm going to read a good portion of it because it puts together some of the thoughts that I've had over the years about this issue of hate crimes. Because what we have are various hate crime legislation that says if you do a crime, but then there is some kind of hate against African Americans, homosexuals, whatever, we will not just punish you for the act, but will also punish you additionally for the thought. And I think it just is a problem at its very core, and it's best illustrated by what happened to Adolfo Martinez in Iowa, who actually did something I wouldn't agree with, but nevertheless stole a rainbow flag and burned it, and then earned 16 years in prison, which I think is, by anybody's imagination, an overreaction. So let's get into the piece. Myron says, does it make sense that a person can burn an American flag with impunity, but not a gay pride flag? Earlier this month, a judge in Story County, Iowa, sentenced Adolfo Martinez to a preposterous 16 years in prison for swiping the rainbow flag from a nearby church and burning it in front of a strip club. Martinez, who, by the way, is age 30, has a long criminal history. Here's the rest that you need to know about, which partially explains the long sentence. He had 2 felony convictions, and an Iowa law deems that if you are a 3-time felon and habitual offender, subject to enhanced sentencing, but a jury convicted Martinez of 3 misdemeanors, that is third-degree arson, for which the maximum penalty is 2 years in prison, along with a third-degree harassment and reckless use of fire, each subject to a maximum 1 year. First of all, this is an overreaction even there to somebody that might be engaged in arson, because the arson is burning a flag. It's not burning a house down. Okay, so first of all, let's put that in perspective. But then Mr. Martinez complicated his own defense by telling a local TV station that he had torched the flag because he didn't like gay people and burned down their pride, plain and simple. Okay, shouldn't have said it, not endorsing anything he has, believe that he deserves to spend time, but 16 years, that's the question we're really asking. So in response, the judge increased the misdemeanor arson charge to a hate crime charge, which is in Iowa and many places a felony, which normally carries a maximum of 5 years. So how did he get 16 years? Well, I just kind of tipped my hand a minute ago. 3 strikes and you're out. So now, because this was a third felony and he had 2 felonies, 3 strikes and you're out. So that inflated his 5-year maximum to 15 years, plus then the extra year for reckless use of fire. So he has been sentenced to 16 years in prison. But the reality is 16 years because he burned a gay flag. Now, let's put this in perspective, because then Myron Magnet goes on to say the absurdity of the sentence points up a larger absurdity of hate crimes as a class of criminal offense. Burning an American flag, according to the Supreme Court, is free speech. That goes all the way back to something that happened when I was at the Republican convention in 1984. Walking in, we see this guy burning an American flag before the Republican convention in Dallas. That case went to the Supreme Court, and even Judge Antonin Scalia, who says, I disagree with somebody burning a flag, I hate it, but at the same time, I also believe that burning a flag is free speech, so he should not be sentenced for burning an American flag, which I thought was really a good illustration of how sometimes, if you just trust the Constitution, you will come to conclusions that sometimes you may disagree with, but you apply the constitutional principle. And so Myron goes on to say that the idea that free speech means free speech is the jewel of American exceptionalism. It's odious and moronic to deny the Holocaust, but it isn't and shouldn't be a crime. The New York Times didn't clutch its pearls when Hillary Clinton dismissed Donald Trump supporters as deplorables who are irredeemable and not America. Nor did the guardians of correct opinion blanch when Barack Obama disparaged a large number of Americans as troglodytes clinging to their guns and religion. Representative Ilhan Omar is entirely at liberty to explain away support for Israel as being all about the Benjamins, baby. And Robert De Niro is similarly free to give the finger to Mr. Trump and his supporters. All of this is as American as apple pie, if less appetizing. And so the point that he makes, and I've made the same point before, is we don't need thought crimes. That comes from George Orwell's 1984. His argument is the same argument I make. Number one, the law should ask only 2 questions. First, do you have the faculty of reason that allows you to distinguish right from wrong? Some people are oftentimes found guilty but insane, or sometimes even found not guilty because of insanity, which I disagree with, but guilty but insane, so they don't understand right from wrong. Number 2, did you intend to do the crime you committed? Beyond that, you have freedom of conscience. You have the freedom to say some pretty outrageous things. You have the freedom to accuse people of some pretty unbelievable things. And now when we start saying that some of the attacks on Jewish people are hate crimes by posting a swastika, as much as we may dislike it, on a car or a synagogue, that can certainly be prosecuted in terms of all sorts of things, graffiti and destroying property and a variety of other things. But to add on to it this idea of hate crimes because somebody said something or believed something is, I think, dangerous. And as probably the best illustration, and you're probably going to hear a commentary from me on this in the future, when Adolfo Martinez, who is not a real nice person, spends now possibly 16 years in prison for burning a rainbow flag, you know that this idea of a hate crime in the hands, especially in this case of a judge, when he might have only spent a year or 2 in prison, is something that just needs to be reevaluated. Let's take a break, though, and that is one of our articles that we've posted on the website today. Very well written. I only summarized some of it, but you can read it in its entirety. Maybe even post it on your Facebook page or use it to have a conversation about this idea of hate crime laws. So it's on the website, pointofview.net. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. Dave, you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Okay, I've oftentimes said that there are 3 radio programs I do every day. The one I think I'm going to do, the one I do, and the one I wish I did. And in some respects, just even talking with Steve a minute ago, I realized that even as I was talking about this issue of hate crimes, I didn't talk about something that I have mentioned before. And I don't know, maybe it's about time to do a booklet on this whole idea of hate crimes and free speech. So we'll see whether that goes anywhere. But he did bring up that idea, which is important because sometimes it is important in a trial to determine whether or not a person's mentality, that is, what is in their mind, was part of the crime. Here's a good example. The difference between an accidental killing and premeditated murder. A little bit later, we're going to be talking with Dr. Tremper Longman, who's the emeritus professor from Westmont, and he's written some great books on the whole idea of ethics. And he, interesting enough, and Wayne Grudem are kind of back and forth on those issues, so there's some disagreement, and I love to provide a forum for people to really address that. But we may even talk to him about that. But in the Old Testament, there's a distinction made between accidental killing, which we oftentimes call manslaughter, and lying in wait is how it's put in the scriptures, and that would be premeditation. So there are times when we recognize that we would have enhanced punishment for what was in your head. That is, did you have a premeditated desire to kill someone or to wound somebody? And that is, I think, most appropriate in our criminal justice system when we're talking about when there's a threat to life or liberty or property or something of that nature, maybe more just for life itself, because the example we're using is, if I sat home and contemplated whether or not to shoplift versus at the moment deciding to stick something in my pocket, would we treat that any differently? Probably not. We'd say the crime, shoplifting, is the crime. It doesn't matter whether you thought about it for 3 seconds or for 2 days. But maybe we would. It's possible. But certainly we do so for murder. So there are some times when it is appropriate in a court of law to evaluate what was in a person's mind. But I do believe that this whole example of using a hate crime law, which then makes it a felony, which then has 3 strikes and you're out, and I think anybody saying that we would dislike and would actually counsel no one to think about ever burning a flag, whether it's an American flag, whether it's a gay flag, a rainbow flag, whether it's a flag of a football team or a basketball team, whatever it might be, we would never condone that. But at the same time, 16 years in prison, something seriously wrong about that. And I wanted to bring it up if for no other reason than I actually had an email or two from people when I did have a commentary a while back that I just mentioned hate crime, in which somebody said, well, then what about this guy in Iowa? Well, we did talk about that briefly, and that is the case. Also, as we were going to a break, I mentioned some of the equipment. I'm not sure this qualifies, but I got a computer sometimes that just locks up. And so I sent something to the printer, and it now finally showed up. And I don't know if it's the computer, which I think it is, or the printer, so I need to get my computer fixed. But it was something else I was going to mention earlier when we talk about the attack on the embassy in Baghdad, and that is the person who was leading this, the so-called point man in this so-called militia, was an individual by the name of Hadi al-Amari. And Hadi al-Amari is an individual that is known to a lot of people, including former President Barack Obama, because this story came out in the Daily Mail that President Barack Obama welcomed him to the White House. And so this man who is the point man in this situation, the one who orchestrated the siege there in Iraq, actually, you can see pictures of him in the White House. And it's, I think, an illustration, again, that sometimes when you're trying to find good actors in the Middle East, really difficult to do, except maybe with Israel. Because the original attack that the American troops had that led to this response was against a group that actually had been fighting against ISIS. So, we've oftentimes said the enemy of my enemy could be my friend. No, the enemy of my enemy in this case was also my enemy. And so you have difficulty finding good actors in the Middle East. And here is an individual who was in the Oval Office with the president in the White House in 2011. And that's, of course, 8 years before he orchestrated this siege in Iraq. So we may talk about a little bit more of that tomorrow, but I just thought those are two stories I talked about in the first segment and then in the second segment that I wanted to add some clarification to as well. Speaking of that, the other day when we were actually doing our year in review and decade in review, you might have heard Kelly Shackelford, if you're with us 2 days ago, quote from this particular letter read by NBC News anchor Chuck Todd. And our good friend Dr. Jim Dennison, and we're going to have him on the show here in the future, wrote about this, in which he reminded us that on last Sunday's Meet the Press, NBC News anchor Chuck Todd read and endorsed a letter claiming that supporters of President Donald Trump want to be lied to since they believe in fairy tales such as Noah's Ark. Now, Kelly read that 2 days ago. I might have ignored that, but since he read it, I thought we'd kind of dig into this a little bit more because I thought it was kind of interesting because Dr. Jim Dennison points out that leaving the politics of this claim aside, he said, let's note that Jews believe in Noah's Ark because it is described as a historical event in the Torah. That's in Genesis 6 through 9. Jesus believed in Noah's Ark because in Matthew 24, he says that in the end times, when the Son of Man returns, it will be like in the days of Noah. We see that Peter refers to Noah's Ark in 1 Peter chapter 3, and then again in 2 Peter chapter 2, as well as it's worth mentioning that not only do Jews and Christians believe in Noah's Ark, Muslims find it in the Quran in Surah 29. So if nothing else, let's see how we can read one letter on this Meet the Press and alienate the three major religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then he goes on to say, then there are all sorts of other people going out of their way to denigrate biblical faith, because here is an article that appeared in the journal or the newsletter Medium, whatever you want to call it. It says, Dear Christians, it's time we dealt with your religious intolerance. And the writer laments that his Nigerian grandfather was chased from his village by Christian converts because he refused to convert to Christianity. Also notes that Christian missionaries imposed upon his father a new name, a new age, language, clothing they deem more appropriate to the faith. And he points to John Allen Chow, a Christian who broke numerous laws and then was killed while attempting to share the gospel with an unreached people group off the coast of India. The author's conclusion is that any religion that believes others need to accept his message or face damnation is egotistical, intrusive, invasive, and intolerant. He is convinced that we should oppose such religions as vehemently as he does. And, of course, then goes into all of the other aspects of this, because if nothing else, we live in a time of persecution, because then at this point, Jim Dennison then goes on to talk about how ISIS has beheaded Nigerian Christians and how, in some respects, this whole idea of persecution, which, by the way, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about in the next hour, in the second hour, I should say, or the third hour, if you want to count this one as the first, but the second hour nationally, because that's kind of a theme that runs in the book, the Bible and the Ballot, using Scripture in political decisions. But nevertheless, I thought it was kind of interesting to see that this whole reading of the letter saying that people want to believe the fairy tales of President Donald Trump because they believe in Noah's Ark illustrates that even when you have the political discussions taking place, there is oftentimes a veiled, in this case, not so veiled shot at anybody that would believe in the Old Testament. And since at least Orthodox Jews I would assume, believe in Genesis, I think most Christians would believe in the book of Matthew and 1st and 2nd Peter. And I would think any at least faithful adherents of Islam would believe in the Quran, and in chapter or Surah 29, Noah's Ark is mentioned in all of those areas. So here's a good example where just making one kind of statement in Meet the Press, Chuck Dodd managed to alienate a lot of people in a lot of different religions. So we'll take a break and come back, and a couple more comments just before we move into our conversation, which will happen at 1 o'clock with Abdu Murray, Saving Truth, Finding Meaning and Clarity in a Post-Truth World. And then a little bit later in the hour following that, Dr. Tremper Longman, The Bible and the Ballot, Using Scripture in Political Decisions. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that the next hour we're going to have Abdu Murray. That'll be our national broadcast, and we're going to be talking about saving truth and the whole issue of post-truth and how you can witness to your friends that maybe have bought into this idea that truth is relative, it's personal, there's no absolute truth. Those kinds of things I think are going to be very helpful in our conversation with him. And if you're not familiar, he's a senior vice president with Ravi Zacharias Ministries. I've gotten to know him pretty well because over the last couple of years, He's been at Camp of the Woods every year that I have been there. He was there 2 years ago anyway, and then last year, of course, I was actually sharing the time there at Camp of the Woods with Ravi Zacharias, so Abdu Murray was there as well. So I've gotten to know him and his family much better, and so it'll be kind of fun to talk with him. And then Dr. Tremper Longman will be with us in the second hour after that. The Bible and the Ballot uses Scripture in political decisions. But since we're still kind of talking primarily to a Texas audience, thought I'd talk about two things real quickly. First of all, my Viewpoints commentary today is on the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and it has to do with the decision that came down first from a judge in Fort Worth, and then a decision that has now come down as well from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which, again, not only covers Texas, but Louisiana, Arkansas, a number of other places. And so this has now returned the case back to the judge in Fort Worth. So it is has national significance, but a lot of it happened in the state of Texas because the original case was brought by the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, and other attorneys general. And so that's the first case. Then, of course, the decision that came down from the Fort Worth judge is that once we no longer have a tax, since the so-called individual mandate was called a tax, since it was zeroed out, that would mean that that part of it is no longer part of the law. And so if that's the foundation for the law is unconstitutional. That's what he ruled, sent it to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said, we sort of agree, but you got to do a little more research in order to come to that conclusion. And so it's back in his court. But it's something we'll be following for some time. And if you'd like to understand the significance of that, because that decision may come down during an election year, and that would mean that some of our members of Congress better have a better answer if indeed Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is declared unconstitutional. Then what? I think I have some very good answers to that. Dr. Merrill Matthews does as well, but I thought I would point you to my Viewpoints commentary today. And if you don't receive my Viewpoints commentary in your inbox, there's a place where you can sign up. Mine comes to you Monday through Friday. Penna Dexter's, that she writes once a week, comes to you on Saturday, and it's free of charge. It's just a way that you can read some of the facts and figures we put together and receive it in your inbox. Some people then post it on their Facebook page. Some people just use it to send to some of their friends, and so it is available to you right here at pointofview.net. The other case, of course, is the amount of commentary that has come over the shooting in the church. And there is a piece that I was thinking about posting, but it's probably not worth mentioning, more just in passing. It comes from Daniel Payne, and he talks about a man by the name of Tom Nichols, who is a friend and former colleague, but is going on one of these kind of Twitter rants about guns. And the argument that this anti-gun Twitter poster is saying, who, by the way, is more than just a Twitter poster, but an individual that addresses some of these issues, is that he believes that concealed carry has created a culture which is really conservative virtue signaling as a stand-in for patriotism. And that he also goes on to say that gun owners measure their sense of worth by whether or not they're carrying firearms, and that now this whole idea of gun worship has become a litmus test for conservatives to the detriment of conservatism itself. And I kind of like what Daniel Payne says. It's safe to say that none of this is true. Do you think? He says, look, for those of us who carry guns, who have a keen interest in gun policy and believe that there is a reasonable place for well-trained gun owners to carry their firearms in public places, do not worship guns, nor do we tie the interest and habits to our self-worth and patriotism. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say, let's face it, a lot of individuals that are carrying a gun, concealed carry or whatever, or are gun owners, hope that they never have to use them. So, I mean, that's the first issue there. They are seen as tools. But then he goes on to say that Tom Nichols, looking at what happened in our church in White Settlement, was basically a lucky break. And again, I love Daniel Payne says, that's precisely the point. This is that hopefully most gun owners hope they would never have to draw their weapons. Virtually none of them aside, he says, from a few blustery dimwits, want to draw their weapon. But this claim that now this has caused the pornification of gun ownership does not comport, he says, with the reality of gun owners who would be happy to live out their lives without ever getting in a firefight. So anyway, it was just a long piece to just simply say there are a lot of people right now that are writing all sorts of negative things about what happened in the church over the weekend. And I've seen some people on Twitter, including George Yancey's been on the program with us before. Wouldn't it be better if just nobody says anything about this? Yeah, it would be, but that's not what's happening, because this other article that appeared just recently points out that you can go to almost any web page, almost any newspaper editorial right now, and see how the left, those people that are actually very left-wing on certainly progressive ideas and certainly would want to have more gun control, are going out of their way to kind of say, well, maybe Jack Wilson was a hero, but Jack Wilson's an individual that actually brought down the shooter. In this particular case, this is one particular writer, Elvia Diaz. Jack Wilson was a hero, right? Unfortunately, that kind of split-second heroism has been turned into a PR tool by gun advocates. Wait, that is, what, unfortunate here? She adds, we know nothing about the other parishioners who appeared to draw their handguns, and that's terrifying. And then suggests that, well, that any evidence, the shooter actually acquired his firearm legally, despite having a long arrest record, although she admits that she's making this assertion without any evidence. You might say, well, that's a one-off. No, it isn't. Here's another one in the Washington Post. In this particular case, the Washington Post editorial board goes right from offering praise to Wilson, again, the individual that brought the shooter down, to said the other shooter, the bad guy, had access to a gun because of the country's lax gun laws. Again, as people are pointing out, that's an assertion. And then they say, we really don't know how he actually got the gun, but we're convinced he got it probably because we have lax gun laws. Okay, that's, again, another one. How about CNN? Here's another one. Are we relegated to finding solace in the fact that only 3 people died inside of a church in the latest tragedy and must seek comfort in the idea that 6 people felt the need to be armed as they worshiped? Is this really how we live in America? And again, it's based on the argument that the shooter got the gun legally. So I will agree that it would be better if nobody would talk about this other than just to simply say, thank you for a man by the name of Jack Wilson who was trained and brought the shooter down. Wish that he was able to have prevented the loss of 2 lives. But you're getting the Jack Wilson is a hero, but, and then the but is always the shooter got the gun legally. There are no evidence at this point that he did. And more importantly, we should be terrified that there were other people in the church that also had guns as well. So this is the kind of conversation that I'm afraid we're going to have even when we have what some people might say relatively good news. And the evidence, as we've said before, that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And I certainly want to give credit to this individual by the name of Jack Wilson, and also pray for him because, as we said the other day, he may be going through this whole idea of PTSD as well. And pray for the congregation that will be meeting this Sunday. Let's take a break, though. We'll talk about truth right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Well, thank you for joining me today. And first of all, let me say Happy New Year. It is again now the year of 2020, and we're going to have so many great things to talk about in this year. But also, even this hour, we're going to have quite a bit as well, because we're going to be talking about the whole issue of truth and how to apply biblical principles to some key issues in the first hour, as we talked with Abdu Murray on his book, Saving Truth: Finding Meaning and Clarity in a Post-Truth World. And then in the next hour, we'll also have Tremper Longman with us, and we'll be talking about his book, The Bible and the Ballot, Using Scripture in Political Decisions. Also, he has a new book out as well, Confronting Old Testament Controversies, about some of these pressing questions in the Old Testament. So there's just a lot that we will be talking about. And before we get into this, let me just mention that as we have now finished off 2019, one of the questions that always comes is, well, how did you do? And, of course, it'll be a few more days before we know, but it looks pretty good, and we want to say thank you to those of you that indeed have supported this ministry. We had originally a $100,000 match, and I know we've met that, but then we were able to bring it up to $150,000, and we have not met that yet, but we recognize that there are some individuals like yourselves that maybe have sent in a gift. It will come in the mail, so I'll give you a full accounting in a day or two, as certainly as the mail comes in. Maybe I have to wait a few more days, but just wanted to let you know that we feel pretty good, and we are appreciative of those of you that have supported this ministry and your year-end giving. And as we go into the year 2020, I hope you'll continue to remember this ministry as we focus on, I think, some really important issues, even this hour, on how to apply biblical principles in a post-truth culture, how to apply biblical principles to some of the issues we'll be talking about during, of course, the 2020 campaign. And so to help us out, first of all, we want to go to Abdu Murray. He's been on the program with us a number of times before. He's Senior Vice President with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Of course, I've had a chance to interview him by phone, but also had a chance on a number of occasions to meet him and his family face-to-face as we've been together at Camp of the Woods and other places. He is an individual you might remember who has written on the subject of Islam. He's a trial attorney, an international speaker, host of the podcast The Defense Rests, and brings just a tremendous amount of expertise and intellect to our conversation. So, Abdu Murray, I want to say Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Kerby. How are you?
I am very good, and it's just great to hear you, and I'm looking forward to this issue. One of the reasons we wanted to kind of start off 2020 is I suspect if 2019 was sort of a post-truth culture, this year is really going to be, I suspect, a post-truth culture, don't you think?
Oh, I do think so. I think we're headed along and diving quite deeply into this post-truth mindset where feelings and appeals to emotion matter a lot more than appeals to facts and actual truth. So I do think that we're heading that way. And in fact, if the end of the year was any indication, especially with an election cycle, I don't think that we're going anywhere near anything but an emotionalism.
And I think what we also have to do is recognize, as I've said before, to read widely. We have a lot of different people from different perspectives sometimes on this program, and it's just because you see something in Twitter. As a matter of fact, this last hour, just on kind of a local broadcast, I was talking about some of the things that are just said on various websites, Twitter posts. You just have to go back and say, is that really the case? And we're going to probably have to address this more than ever, because I'm a little bit older than you, so I'll be the old guy around the table. I remember a time when if Walter Cronkite said it, I might have disagreed with it, but I figured it was based on a fair amount of fact and evaluation. And even if I may have come to a different conclusion on a few occasions, I recognize that there was a real attempt to try to, at least from that vantage point, try to get some verification for facts. Now, it isn't just Twitter posts and Facebook pages, but even sometimes so-called reputable organizations which will state something as factual, and it turns out to not be true at all. So this is, I think, the need for us to read your book and understand it even more so, because we really need to develop, I guess the key word for this hour interview is the issue of discernment, right?
That's absolutely correct. It's funny because I think about two issues that come to mind. The first one is that, and I don't want to bag on the media too much because I know that can be a comfortable thing for us to do, is to say, oh, the mainstream media. But the reality is that it's never been more suspect now in terms of its credibility across the spectrum. So if you're on the right, the left is always telling lies, and if you're on the left, the right's always telling lies. And if you're a centrist, the right and the left are always telling lies. Everyone always suspects everyone now. But I think that one of the reasons behind this, first and foremost, I think, is the human condition of being post-truth beings. I think that we are, in one sense, post-truth beings, even though we were created by the one who is the very foundations of all truths. We tend to be beings in our sinfulness that are post-truth. But I think one of the symptoms of that, which has blossomed in, I think, media, is the invention of 24-hour news. And I was thinking about this thoroughly with a friend the other day, that because we have, you can tell the news, and Walter Cronkite used to do this in an hour or less. You can tell all the important things that happened in a particular day in a very short period of time. But now we have 23 more hours to fill. And what do? We fill it with a lot of opinion and speculation and conjecture. And, of course, that creates a mentality, whether it's right-leaning or left-leaning or whatever it might be, where we have to fill it up with people who have opinions. And those opinions are inherently biased. And so journalism now becomes its own story, where the story is the story or the reporter is the story. That didn't used to be the case. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we have this inherent now lengthy distrust about all things media, which is an unfortunate thing because we still get our information from such folks, but we need to hold them to a high standard and also be of a high character ourselves, which leads me to my second point, is that one of the things I think is true, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, is that the church has succumbed to the temptation to be not just in and not of the culture, but in and of the culture in terms of contributing to a post-truth world. We've done it ourselves quite a bit, where we may have spread either things we know are fake or that we should have known aren't really true, or given it a moment's research before we clicked like or share or whatever it might be.
And again, that is chapter 2 in the book, by the way, Confusion and the Church Seductions of a Post-Truth Mindset. And this is something that has always been the case long before there was a lot of social media. I remember that even for the Probe radio program, I did a whole thing on Christian myths. And the reason I did that is because we were finding that a lot of the Christian radio stations at that time were hearing all sorts of erroneous stories, or people were calling up or sending emails saying that Madeleine Murray O'Hair is trying to pull Christian radio off the air, even after she was not even alive anymore, that the Procter & Gamble was a satanic symbol, and on and on and on. There were just so many of those, and so I just did an entire week of programs, then put it on the website so that nothing else, the radio stations that oftentimes would get these petitions or then later these emails say, no, that's not true, and Kerby Anderson was able to discount it, because so often we in the church are guilty of sometimes spreading kind of a post-truth mindset. So let's take a break. This book, Saving Truth, is published by Zondervan. We have a link so that you can get it both in paperback and in Kindle. We'll look at this in the general way, and then we're going to apply this to things like freedom and dignity and sexuality and science and faith and pluralism. And I think you will certainly benefit from this conversation about saving truth. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The future of the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, is in legal limbo. A three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals essentially declared the law unconstitutional, but sent it back to the federal district court to evaluate its status. 2 years ago, the attorneys general of a number of states, led by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, asked a federal judge in Fort Worth to strike down the law as unconstitutional. Their argument was simple. The bill was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court because the individual mandate was considered a tax. Since Congress has the power to levy a tax, it was constitutional. But Congress removed the penalty, and so the argument being made was the Obamacare Foundation collapsed by no longer requiring the penalty, which the Supreme Court called a tax. U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor in December 2018 ruled the entire law unconstitutional. Now, a year later, the judges in the Fifth Circuit Court seem to agree, but they sent the ruling back to the first judge to answer a key question. That question is the issue of severability. If part of the law is unconstitutional, does that mean that all of the law is unconstitutional, or does that mean you can sever part of the law and still maintain the rest of the law? The circuit court judges ruled that the opinion of the district judge needs to do the necessary legwork in order to reach his conclusions. All of this means that the law is in a bit of legal limbo. It also means that it could be struck down and declared unconstitutional. That means that Congress needs to get serious about crafting legislation that could be put in its place if it no longer exists. We should ask our member of Congress, as well as people running for Congress in 2020, what they propose to do about this. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Abdu Murray. His book is entitled Saving Truth. And by the way, the book's been out for some time, so you may be able to find it in a local bookstore, or maybe because it's been out for a while, you might want to order it directly. We have a link to his website, so you can get the book from him. Of course, we also have one as well that you can find on our website, so you can get it in Kindle or paperback, and I do recommend it. I do know from time to time as I travel around, some of you say, every time I listen to Point of View, I have to spend some more money, buy another book. But, you know, reading is important, and leaders are readers, and reading is important, and especially as we enter into this year of 2020, probably even more so to have discernment about this post-truth world that we live in. And in Chapter 3, Abdu Murray, we have a section on confusion's consequences, getting freedom wrong. And I want to also, if anything, rely upon your legal background because, first of all, there are a lot of individuals in the secular world that obviously don't understand freedom, but even Christians don't as well. And you talk about some of the sacrifices, our ability to reason, for example, as well as the issue of moral accountability and some of the rest. So talk about this idea of freedom that so many in our culture tend to get wrong.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I think it's one of the most misunderstood concepts because it's so ubiquitous. We use this word freedom all the time, and we think it means the ability to do what you want, whenever you want, in whatever way you want, at whatever time you want. And that sounds certainly like unmitigated, absolute freedom. But that's not what freedom actually is. You know, Isaiah Berlin speaks on the issues of the positive and the negative sides of freedom. He doesn't mean positive in terms of good and negative in terms of bad. What he means is positive freedom is the freedom for the greater good or freedom for excellence. In other words, there's a moral stricture or a moral dimension to freedom where you have the obligation, the duty to use your freedoms for that which is for the higher good. Negative freedom is simply freedom from restriction. Now, when we use the word freedom in this country, we tend to use it in the negative sense. In other words, freedom from restriction. I can say what I want. I can do what I want. I can be what I want nowadays even. But that's talk about a one-sided coin or a one-ended stick. It doesn't make any sense, actually, because freedom, as the framers envisioned it, as I think even the Bible envisions it, is a freedom that is in accordance with the moral law. And that moral law is not a dictate of human preferences or opinions, which of course is the issue, isn't it? Because that's exactly what a post-truth culture is. A post-truth culture is one that appeals to that appeals to feelings and preferences and elevates them above facts and truth. And in order to get around this idea that we have a moral law, an objective moral law above us, we basically abandon the moral law altogether and say freedom is the highest moral, and that means that we can do whatever we want. But that's not really freedom. That's autonomy. And autonomy comes from the Greek root words, autos, meaning self, and nomos, meaning law. So when you're a law unto yourself, you can do and say and think and act and be whatever you want, whenever you want. But there's the problem here. And I think the framers knew this when it came to the Constitution. I think that God himself, as he expresses to us what true freedom is throughout the Bible, understands this. If people are a law unto themselves, if I'm a law unto myself, and no one can dictate to me what's right and what's wrong, and my preferences matter more than the truth, here's the problem. If I'm a law unto myself, and someone else who's a law unto themselves, who has equal authority as I do, to flout or make up moral laws as they want, if our preferences clash and truth no longer decides who's right and who's wrong, then truth will not be the arbiter between us. It'll be power that determines who's right and who's wrong. And so isn't it tremendously ironic that in our quest for autonomy or quote-unquote unlimited freedom, someone ends up enslaved? Someone's ideas get squished. And it's not because of truth or falsehood. It's because of power. That's the ultimate abuse. So we become enslaved to our own quest for freedom. And that's exactly what the Bible, and I think that the framers of the Constitution of the United States understood, and we can't have that. There's got to be a positive freedom, the freedom to do that which is excellent and good and for the greater cause. Otherwise, we have bedlam. And I think we have to understand that as a people. We have a very serious confusion about what freedom actually is. But we can recover it. We just need to understand it and have the, as Os Guinness puts it, the only true restraint on freedom that doesn't kill freedom is self-restraint. We don't seem to have any of that lately.
Yes. Well, and again, to use a biblical phrase, if everybody does what is right in their own eyes, you end up with anarchy sooner or later, because doing my own thing gets in the way of your thing. And as you said, then if it's only resolved by power, it's kind of what our postmodern philosophers have been telling us. But since you mentioned Os Guinness, he's been on the program with us many times before, and you have a quote here from Free People's Suicide that freedom sounds simple, straightforward, and self-evident, but freedom is both more complex and more contested than we realize. But that's kind of the idea. We have the negative freedom and the positive freedom that you talked about. And there is a real need for us as Christians to, even though we do spend a fair amount of time on this program talking about religious freedom, that is the freedom from the government interfering in our lives as we preach the gospel or whatever, we need to understand that we don't want to be, in a sense, co-opted by the secular culture and adopt the secular world's view of freedom. True?
That's absolutely right, because that leads to this sense that all we care about is freedom from restrictions, when in reality what we're talking about is to live our religious convictions, but our religious convictions necessarily entail limitations by the moral code, by the moral law that we didn't create, that we are just the perceivers of and the receivers of, but not the creators of. And it all ties down to purpose to me. Give an example of this.
Yeah.
My backyard is a large backyard, but before we moved into that backyard, that house, we had my oldest was my only at the time, and he was very young. And my wife and I didn't want to buy this house because we thought, my goodness, this beautiful backyard where the kids can play backs up to a main road, and so there's cars and trucks whizzing by. And if we give our kids unmerited freedom, or unlimited freedom, I should say, to play in the backyard, they're going to get pulverized by the cars that are whizzing by. But if we set up a barrier, not too many restrictions, just one restriction that says you can't play beyond here, then they could enjoy the purpose of the backyard. They would have the freedom to enjoy the purpose of the backyard. And so for the Christian who understands that there's a moral purpose and a moral law that is objective, based in reality, not based on our preferences, we can have freedom if we understand the purpose for which we were created. And true freedom isn't the ability to do what you want, it's the ability to do what you want based on what you should, in accordance with what we are. We are made in God's image, and our freedoms are truly free if they are in accordance with the relationship we were created to have.
Yes. And again, I think some people, even young kids, would say, well, I've got mean parents because they won't let me go all the way to the end of the backyard. But you recognize the value of that. And a lot of it has to do with emotions. You know, we've had Jonathan Haidt on. He was the co-author of the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And the argument, one of the, if you will, false ideas that he says has been really adopted by this generation is that always trust your emotions. And if you're perceiving the world through your emotions, then you're going to see God and government and everybody as making you a victim. But if you understand that oftentimes with proper boundaries, that's really freedom. That's why it's important to be able to get beyond your emotional reaction, get beyond your victimhood, and recognize that there are some very good reasons why we have boundaries in the world, and that's to keep people safe.
That's right, and you know, we can have something that's too draconian where, you know, for your own safety, we're going to remove some aspect of your freedoms from you. We have to trust people in some sense, but in another sense, we have to understand that, you know, we're sinful people, and that's just reality. You don't need a science experiment to tell you beyond human observation that we are self-seeking people. So we need to have some moral boundaries to keep us from eating each other, essentially.
Yes.
But at the same time, we can't have so many restrictions that, you know, it's a safe world, but a non-free world as well. So there's always that level of balance, which is why Berlin talks about the balance of the negative and the positive freedom. If you have too much positive freedom, then you're basically, the state is telling you what's good and what's bad, and you should do that. If you have too much negative freedom, then no one's telling you that, and it's all, you know, bedlam. But if you have the proper balance, which is why I love what the Bible says, and it's funny, you quoted it earlier, when everyone was doing was right in his own eyes. The scriptures are so fun, so interesting to me because they speak to cultural issues before they even happen, or we think of it as an outdated book written by dusty old people for dusty old times, when the reality is it's an eternal contemporary, because that's when the Old Testament, in the time of the judges, when people were doing whatever they wanted to do in their own way, it led to chaos and debauchery and immorality and death and inequality. But it's the scriptures that actually bring us back to a moral center.
Yes.
So the things that we're seeing today are not new. They're just new things happening to new people, but they're all old precepts that the Bible for centuries has addressed.
Abdu Murray with us, Saving Truth, and we'll come back and talk about human dignity, sexuality, religious pluralism. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Abdu Murray. And again, the book is entitled Saving Truth. It's been out for a while, Finding Meaning and Clarity in a Post-Truth World. This hour we'll spend some time, or this half hour, we'll talk about human dignity and sexuality, religious pluralism, and some of those. But Abdu, for just a minute, let's, if we can, talk about your website. It's abdumurray.com, easy to find, but we also have a link there. I remember you used to, when the book came out, have kind of a launch bonus. I don't know if you're still doing that, but there's a way in which people can not only get copies of this book from you, but also an executive summary and, most importantly, a study guide, because I want people, as we go into 2020, to really develop a level of discernment, especially in this post-truth culture. But I also think that the way your book is written, this would be ideal for somebody as they're starting out this year to have a small group Bible study or a Bible fellowship, maybe even a preaching series in a church. And so, as I understand, there's a study guide that goes with that. Talk about what is available to some of our listeners.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much, Kerby. I appreciate it. So there is the book, obviously. If you go to abdumurray.com, you can see that. And there's a study guide and executive summary. The study guide goes chapter by chapter through it, but there's also a video curriculum that can be used with the study guide or all by itself. That goes through each chapter of the book and provides some additional information. As you know, as an author yourself, there's word limits to the book that you write, so you can't include every illustration or every point you want to make. And so I am able to, in the video curriculum, which you can also see at abdumurray.com, also rzim.org. You can see some of these things as well, where you can go and get the video curriculum, the study guide of the book, or all of them put together. And we've already received feedback from some folks who've really enjoyed doing a small group or even large group studies using the book as the guide.
And again, if you think discernment is going to be a big issue, and I do believe that it is, this is something that you want to pass on to people in your sphere of influence. So see this as one resource that might be very helpful. Again, there's the book, there's the videos, there's study guide, and a variety of other resources. And, of course, I would encourage you to support Ravi Zacharias Ministries, just an outstanding organization, and just have the highest respect for every one of those people on staff. And so let's get back to the book, because I want to take a few more application points. We sort of did a little bit of application on freedom. What about this idea of human dignity? Next hour, we're going to be talking about, I suspect, everything that relates to human dignity, like abortion or bioethics. We'll probably get into issues of race and race relations. But again, we need, as you point out in Chapter 5, this idea of clarity about human dignity. Help us out.
Well, and the reason why we need clarity is because we're so confused about it. So there are competing movements happening within, I think, secularized and secular, meaning not necessarily atheistic, but non-religious understandings of human dignity and freedom and these kind of things. So the first thing is that there's this rise of people who want to sort of reduce us to chemical machines. We're complex chemical machines. I was at a debate, and an atheist called human beings meat computers,
yes,
which is basically just a crude way of saying we're biochemical machines that aren't really people. We just think we are. There's also a movement to call us sophisticated chimps, that we're just a product of time plus matter plus chance through the process of evolution of random mutations and natural selection, and out we come, with no prevision in mind. These just reduce us either to, computer-like robotic things and chemical reactions, or they make us, they reduce us down to mere animality, where there's no real moral dimension to things. And so there's a confusion there, because then we use words like, well, we should do this, or our, penal system in the United States should become this or that. Well, we're using this word should, and that implies morality.
Yes.
But if we're just chemical machines or animals, then should isn't really a moral concept. It's a convenience concept. And so we've lost all true sense of what it means to be human in the first place, because we have divested ourselves of anything transcendent. And what the Bible does is it brings the clarity back to what it is we all really believe in the first place. So, for example, we have these issues today, social justice issues, whether it's racism or it's sexism, Me Too movements, and all these things that are bringing to the fore the idea that it's wrong to treat people a certain way based on their gender or based on their race or ethnicity. Well, all that's, of course, true. It is wrong to do that. But why? If we're just chemical machines or sophisticated chimps, and evolution is, by definition, the process by which the stronger dominate the weaker, well, then there is no right or wrong to these concepts. But each one of us knows there is something inherently wrong with treating people differently based upon solely their gender or based solely upon their ethnicity and their race in a discriminatory way. And the reason that is wrong is because there's something about every man and woman in the world, regardless of their background, that does not depend upon their economic, racial, ethnic, or gender circumstances. It is that image of God, because it is the one thing about us that is common to all of us, and it is immutable. It's not changeable. It's an inherent characteristic, and it's a value given to us by the inherent value giver. Without that transcendent nature, without that thing that goes beyond human opinion, all we're left with is human opinion. And if we look at history, human opinion is a terrible determiner of who's valuable and who's not. We are constantly determining who's valuable and who's not, and acting in a way that shows us that we think some people are more valuable than others. But if there's a God above to whom we're all accountable, then human dignity actually makes sense. And the common refrains about ending racism and sexism and all these other isms and schisms, then those actually begin to make sense. Without it, we're going to be hopelessly confused and never be able to come to resolution.
Yeah. How can you come to any moral oughts if indeed you're just a mute computer and you're just predetermined by your DNA? But since you mentioned gender, and that gets into the issue of sexuality and gender, one of the larger chapters in your book, and I appreciate the fact that you didn't shy away from it, are those who will say, well, you know, again, we have had a civil rights movement because those that were African American were poorly treated. Very true. We now in the homosexual movement are sometimes feel like we're poorly treated. So how do we make that distinction? And you even open by talking about a question that a young lady asked about the whole issue of homosexuality. So it's obviously something that you and Ravi Zacharias and others have had to address. Help us out to figure out how we provide clarity and communicate our biblical convictions, but also biblical compassion. Love and truth come together, don't they?
They do indeed, and I'm so glad you asked this question because it's funny, people ask me all the time, what are the most common questions you guys get on university campuses or other places? And, you know, people are still concerned with the age of the earth and science and faith and is the Bible accurate? Still concerned with that, but most of our questions are either existential or moral or meaning-based questions. And this sexuality issue is one of the most common, if not the most common one we get now. And so using her as a paradigm, I think it's important that we don't only just describe what the Bible says, and I think it's pretty clear what the Bible says. The Bible has this restriction on sexual expression as between one man and one woman within the bonds of marriage. And so the question isn't really what does it say. I know some people are questioning what it says and trying to reinterpret it, but I think those are very, very weak arguments that actually try to skirt the issue itself. It tries to get around the passages of the Bible that aren't necessarily, quote-unquote, culturally sensitive or politically correct. But in order to be a realist and someone who's honest with the data, we have to wrestle with the tough passages or the culturally tough passages and say, they say what they say. Now the question is, why do they say what they say? And one thing I share with the young lady, and without going into the lengthy explanation I gave her, but just a bit of it, is that the Bible is seen as, going back to our issue of freedom, as a freedom-restricting book. Like, you know, it says sexuality is this way because we find other forms of sexuality icky, and we're going to use God to justify our biases. That's not what the Bible's all about. The culture thinks that. That's not what it's about at all. Jesus says you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So knowledge, truth, freedom all go together, not feelings and truth. Not feelings and freedom, but knowledge and truth and freedom all go hand in hand. So what I said to the young lady was essentially this, is that the Bible says what it says, among many reasons, about sexuality, is that you and I get to reflect the diversity of the Creator. The Creator is a unified diversity. In the Christian message, He is one being in three persons. And as a human being, as a male, created in God's image as a male, I bear God's image in a unique male way. Females, the Bible says, were created in God's image in their femaleness. So a woman bears God's image and that beautiful, divine sort of spark in her femaleness. If I swap her out for someone just like me, I lose something in the process, and she would lose something in the process if she did the same. So marriage and sexuality within the bonds of marriage affords us the opportunity to reflect unity of diversity. We're biologically diverse, we're psychologically diverse, we're just diverse, and we complement each other in beautiful ways. Why would we want to rob ourselves of that inherent beauty? But there's more to it than that, is that every human being is considered sacred. Back to the dignity issue once again. We are created sacredly in God's image. And
let
if we
me
are
jump
the
in real
product,
quick, because we've got one of those mandatory breaks. You got a good point here, but I've got one of those mandatory breaks, so we'll talk more about sacredness right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Take a few more minutes with Abdu Murray, and the book is entitled Saving Truth. I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, the breaks wait for no one. But let's talk a little bit more about this idea of gender, but especially this idea of male and female and how to think about that in terms of God's plan.
Well, as I was, saying is that the idea here is that there's an inherent sacredness to every human being in their maleness and in their femaleness. After all, the Bible does say that God created them male and female. In his image, he created them. So if people are sacred, human beings, both male and female, are sacred, well, they're the product of something. And if we are sacred as a product, then that means the process by which we come about is itself also sacred.
Good.
And the process by which we come about is sex. And if sex has no rules, has no boundaries, has no restrictions, then it becomes less and less sacred. It becomes common, which is oftentimes why you see, I think, pornography addictions progress the way they do. You know, experts will tell you that pornography addiction isn't satisfied by more pornography. It's satisfied, even then not satisfied, by different kinds of pornography, because the old becomes common and no longer satisfies. So we lose the sense of the sacred and the wonder if we have an unencumbered expression of sexuality. So I think the Bible recognizes this. I think God recognizes this. And then because we're sacred, then the process by which we come about is sacred. And in order to keep it sacred, there has to be restriction in terms of its expression. So the two things that go hand in hand are that we're inherently created sacred to give the opportunity to us to have relationship with the divine creator and then reflect his splendor in the unity of his diversity. I told that to the young lady, and she was crying, and we got to pray together afterwards. One of the reasons why is because she said, no one's ever told me I was made in God's image before.
Wow.
She'd only heard the anger and the rancor and the, turn away from your sin kind of a thing, as opposed to saying, God doesn't want you to turn away from the sin alone. He wants you to turn towards him and realize your true and honest purpose. I think that's where the truth and love meet. It's not just what the Bible says, but why the Bible says it. And it's pro-freedom. It's pro-purpose. It's pro-love. It's not anti any of these things. And that, of course, bleeds into the gender issues we have today about fluidity and all these things. Given how rare true gender dysphoria actually is, we come to think of male and female as interchangeable, and in that we start to lose the inherent sacredness of what it means to be male or female. And folks who want congruity in their lives, their mind and their body don't match up, and they don't like that. They want congruity. They don't want this dysphoria. They want a euphoria, as it were, to have it match up. Well, I think in the current trend, we're actually using these poor people as guinea pigs or pawns in a game where we want to determine whatever is true. We want to be lost into ourselves once again. And in the process, people who actually who are hurting, who have the dysphoria, are being left behind. But if we can reaffirm the essential dignity of every human being and say this will be a tough struggle, but we can go through it with you and try to find that congruity, maybe not this side of heaven, but eventually it will be there, only the cross offers it, because only the cross offers an inherent sacredness that's proven by not only the death of Jesus, but the historical verifiability of his resurrection. Wholeness is coming on this side of heaven, possibly, but for certain on the other side of it.
And one of the things I think runs through the entire book is this idea that really Christianity has the answer, and that, as you have sometimes already pointed out, when we talk about things like freedom or human dignity, or even right now we talk about sexuality and gender, the world's answers are really flawed, and they are logically inconsistent and not coherent. So just before we run out of time here, let's talk about how people could really teach this, because I see this as certainly a perfect setup with your study guide and with the book to talk about freedom and dignity, sexuality, science and faith, religious pluralism, to talk about this culture of confusion and the like. But how would somebody go about taking this book and the study guide and putting it together? Would you suggest maybe a chapter a week? And what are some of the resources, especially those video resources? How are those to be integrated with the book as well?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I think that because it's only 9 chapters, that we can go through 9 chapters, one a week, I think would be a good way to start. The study guide and the video can be something that supplements. The study guide can supplement the reading, and so while you're reading it, you can look at the questions and come up with some good answers and even your own independent thoughts on the matter. And then the videos will sort of crystallize it. So when you, on your own, read it and then come together as a small group, watching the videos, because they're short, they're 20 minutes long, short videos that will stimulate conversation. And I think that's when the information really sticks, when the conversations based on the videos and the book crystallize in your mind, and you say, no, I can apply and add my own thoughts to this matter, and how can I reach out not only and safeguard myself against post-truth mindset, but also help others who maybe are succumbing to a post-truth mindset. So if they go hand in hand, study guide and book together, then watch the videos, then have a lengthy discussion. I think that'll be the best way.
I just mentioned again, all of that is available at abdumurray.com. Of course, we have a link, so you don't have to even know how to spell it, or if you're driving right now, don't have to write that down because it's available. There are a number of endorsements and a way in which people can contact you, because, Abdu, I would encourage people as well to find out if you could come and speak to their particular church. I know you and Ravi oftentimes go to major universities in communities, so if they would be interested in having you come and speak, or if somebody would like to interview you on their radio program or podcast, you're available as well, and they can find that on your website, can't they?
They can. If they go to RZIM, that's RZIM.org. There's a speakers page, and there's a request form right on the top.
Well, it has just been a delight to have you on the program, and as we head into 2020, I wanted to encourage people to develop discernment. We've needed discernment in the first century. We certainly need it in the 21st century, and we certainly have needed in the midst of the cacophony of voices and all of this post-truth world to begin to understand biblical truth. And, of course, I have only covered a few of the chapters in the book, so that's why I'd encourage people to get a copy of the book, get the study guide, read it for yourself, take a group through it, and prepare for what we're going to be encountering here in this year 2020. So, Abdu, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby, so much. Happy New Year to you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have Tremper Longman with us, and we'll talk about his book, The Bible and the Ballot. Also, thought I'd just mention in passing, Confronting Old Testament Controversies. It looks at 4 of the big controversial issues in the Old Testament. Creation, evolution, of course, sexuality, which we just talked about, history, and violence, the whole issue of Yahweh wars. So those are just a couple of his books. He's written about 36 different books, and as an individual that is now the emeritus professor of biblical studies from Westmont. Before that, he taught at Westminster. Couldn't get the words out. And indeed, you will find out a lot of great information from him as we cover this in the next hour. Just before we take a break, though, let me just mention my Viewpoints commentary today has to do with the issue of the Affordable Care Act. That is something we will be talking about this year because more recently you had a federal judge, first in Fort Worth, actually declaring that the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, is no longer constitutional. Unconstitutional because no longer does the individual mandate involve a tax. And so that went to the Fifth Circuit Court. They returned it back to him saying, yeah, maybe indeed the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, but you need to do more research before we come to that conclusion. And eventually, if indeed it goes back to the Fifth Circuit Court, may eventually go to the Supreme Court. And it is possible that Affordable Care Act might be declared unconstitutional. And that will become another campaign issue in 2020, no doubt. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, the Viewpoints commentary today explains that in a little more detail. And if you don't already receive my Viewpoints commentary, let me encourage you to sign up because there's an opportunity for you to receive my commentary in your inbox Monday through Friday. Benedictures would arrive on Saturday, so you can sign up to receive it as well. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Bible and the ballot, using Scripture in political decisions. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we head into this 2020, there are, of course, going to be political campaigns, but there's always the issue about how do we think about these issues from a biblical point of view. And in particular, lots of times there's all sorts of pushback from things that maybe are found in the Old Testament. So how do we apply that? How do we apply some of the issues in the New Testament? Is there a difference between what is written in the Old Testament and the New Testament in terms of trying to develop a biblical view on some of these contemporary issues? So those are just a few of the many things we're going to try to cover this hour in this new book that has come out called The Bible and the Ballot, Scripture in Political Decisions. It is written by Dr. Tremper Longman. Might also mention another book I have in my hands here, Confronting Old Testament Controversies, which we might get to sometime in the future, because it deals with some of those very pressing questions in the four kind of big areas of sexuality, which you talked about a little bit last hour: creation, evolution, history, violence, the whole called Yahweh Wars. But if you're not familiar, Tremper Longman is a distinguished scholar, now professor emeritus of biblical studies at Westmont, and before that taught at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia for 18 years. Author of almost 36 different books, including an introduction to the Old Testament, how to read Proverbs, the last world of the flood, as well as all sorts of commentaries on various Old Testament books. And he joins us now by phone. So, Tremper Longman, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks a lot, Kerby. Great to be with you.
Let's say we can get into this whole idea of biblical interpretation. And before we do so, you spent a little bit of time just helping us understand that there are different ways that Christians have related to the culture. And there have been some that have said, well, we need to maybe separate away from the culture. Maybe it's the Benedict option. Others say we need to be involved in transforming the culture. And so this is only a small part of the book, but it is part of your introduction. Can you help us through that? Because there have been different ways over the years that Christians of different stripes have really tried to relate to this idea of Christ in culture. True?
That's very true, Kerby. Yeah, and a lot of different answers have been given, and you've mentioned a few of them there. I mean, it's navigating what Jesus tells us about being in the world but not of it, and to be as wise as serpent and as innocent as doves. How do we flesh that out? The first thing I think we have to recognize is that, we as Christians and the church is different than the broader society, the culture. And so the question is, how do we relate to that broader culture? And the other presumption, I would argue, is no matter how wonderful our culture is, and I have a great deal of love for American culture and society, it's still fundamentally toxic to our faith, not the same way that, say, Christians living in China or Iran or something where it's toxic to their faith. But we still have to recognize that we have to make some decisions. And one of them is, first of all, how do we involve ourselves in culture? And to make a long story short, I don't think there's a simple answer to that question.
No.
And I've been, and I think it depends on the time period. It depends on the issue. Sometimes, we need to withdraw. Sometimes we need to try to transform and persuade. And So, but we always have to ask, how can we live as faithful believers in a toxic culture? And Daniel has been a great inspiration to me, reading through the book of Daniel and watching Daniel navigate his life in the Babylonian court. And it's kind of surprising the way sometimes he reacts to the Babylonian court.
But again, we have to recognize that sometimes it's, well, can we find an alternative? Meat not sacrificed to idols, it's probably not kosher. Other times it's either bow down or pay a penalty, or Daniel in the lion's den. So in some respects, we'll have to think through those issues as well. I might just mention this book called The Bible and the Ballot has a whole section on the Bible and public policy. And we're going to focus on that for a few minutes. And then we'll go into the second section on biblical principles for controversial issues. But if there's one thing you are known for, it is certainly as one of the main translators for the New Living Translation, having written so many commentaries on the Old Testament. But help us with this idea of interpretation. If there's a theme that I've seen run through some of your books, it is, you know, the Bible was not written for you. You have to understand it in the culture in which it was written. And so sometimes when somebody will wrench a scripture out of context from the Old Testament and apply it to our 21st century world, there's a problem with interpretation, isn't there?
Yes, we have to remember, as you just stated, that the biblical books were written by, ultimately, I believe by God, but God inspires human beings to write. And when they're writing to a specific ancient audience. They're writing in Hebrew, in the Old Testament, in Greek, in the New Testament. They're using literary forms and metaphors and interacting with issues that were pressing on their contemporaries. The reason why I think the church recognizes these books as being written for us, even though they weren't written to us, is because, you know, that the message that they are communicating is relevant for God's people at all times and all places. But it does take work to ask, does this Old Testament passage apply to me today, and in what way? And even same with the New Testament. And that's the task of interpretation.
It certainly is. And when we come back from the break, I want to maybe get into this issue just for a minute before we get into some other specifics of the difference between continuity and discontinuity. I've talked about this on the program before, and it is something that I think is really key, because if people sometimes are told that, well, you're taking a verse that was in the Old Testament out of context, and besides, if you believe that particular verse in the Old Testament applies, well, there are other verses there, for example, that say that you're not supposed to have clothes of mixed threads, and I can see what you're wearing right now, or that you're not supposed to eat shellfish, and I know you went to Red Lobster the other day, so you're being somewhat hypocritical. So the skeptics of Christianity use this because they don't understand continuity and discontinuity. But there have been some individuals that also in the Christian world have sometimes wanted to fail to understand the difference between continuity and discontinuity. So we'll certainly spend some time talking about that as well. Might just mention that some of these books that we are talking about today have been endorsed. Peter Wehner was on with us in October. The other book I mentioned by Paul Copan, he's been on the program many times. Matter of fact, as we've talked about some of those issues, for example, is God a Moral Monster, and the so-called Yahweh Wars and some of that. So this is a book that is published by Erdman's, and we have information about Tremper Longman and his website on our website. We have information about this paperback book, and you can also get it in Kindle. And when we come back, we'll talk about this important issue of continuity and discontinuity. Then we'll start applying it, if we can, before the hour's up, to some of these very important issues that we talk about so often here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The future of the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, is in legal limbo. A three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals essentially declared the law unconstitutional, but sent it back to the federal district court to evaluate its status. 2 years ago, the attorneys general of a number of states, led by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, asked a federal judge in Fort Worth to strike down the law as unconstitutional. Their argument was simple. The bill was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court because the individual mandate was considered a tax. Since Congress has the power to levy a tax, it was constitutional. But Congress removed the penalty, and so the argument being made was the Obamacare Foundation collapsed by no longer requiring the penalty, which the Supreme Court called a tax. U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor in December 2018 ruled the entire law unconstitutional. Now, a year later, the judges in the Fifth Circuit Court seem to agree, but they sent the ruling back to the first judge to answer a key question. That question is the issue of severability. If part of the law is unconstitutional, does that mean that all of the law is unconstitutional, or does that mean you can sever part of the law and still maintain the rest of the law? The circuit court judges ruled that the opinion of the district judge needs to do the necessary legwork in order to reach his conclusions. All of this means that the law is in a bit of legal limbo. It also means that it could be struck down and declared unconstitutional. That means that Congress needs to get serious about crafting legislation that could be put in its place if it no longer exists. We should ask our member of Congress, as well as people running for Congress in 2020, what they propose to do about this. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have with us Tremper Longman, and again, a distinguished professor and now professor emeritus of biblical studies at Westmont, author of about 36 books, including this one, The Bible and the Ballot. But I wanted to get into, if I could, this idea of continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testament. When I oftentimes am speaking on the subject of Christian ethics, I bring that up because I think it is a very important issue that is going to be helpful in terms of how we apply some of these Old Testament principles in this 21st century world. True?
Very true, Kerby. I take my first cue from Jesus' words at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. When he talks about, he says, "Don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. Tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved." And, this idea of the law achieving its purpose and therefore completing its relevance is part of the continuity and discontinuity issue. And, of course, we all know the obvious examples, like the laws concerning sacrifice or the laws concerning kosher foods, since those serve the purpose of keeping Jews away from Gentiles and so forth. But then there are laws that are, we're in continuity with. And but even then we have a further question to ask. Think of what Jesus says in Matthew 19:1 and following about divorce. When the disciples, when the Jews come up and ask about divorce, and Jesus says you can only get divorced for reasons of sexual unfaithfulness, and the disciples go, "Wait a minute, that's not what Moses said." They're they're thinking of a passage in the book of Deuteronomy about divorce.
Yes.
And Jesus doesn't say, oh, you misunderstand Moses, or Moses is no longer relevant. But he said, Moses spoke because of the hardness of your heart. And so as you look at some laws, take another example, like polygamy, which is permitted in the Old Testament. These are laws that were relevant for their time, taking God's people where they were and moving them along. I should quickly say that I think, as a general principle, the general idea of the Ten Commandments are, these general ethical principles that remain valid. The case law is applying those principles to specific situations that are particularly relevant to Israel at that time.
Yes, and again, a lot of that is during the Old Testament theocracy, and I think most people would recognize there's a discontinuity between certainly the ceremonial law and the New Testament, obviously, a discontinuity even in terms of some of the, if you will, some of the, like you said, case law, but at least the moral law, there is a continuity there as well. So when somebody says, well, you're looking at Genesis 19 or Leviticus 18 and 20, on homosexuality or whatever the issue might be, well, that's all Old Testament. Well, first of all, some of that is refreshed in the New Testament, I think in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 7, other passages like that. So part of it is just a recognition that we do have some continuity in the moral law, and a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about the rest of this hour are kind of our moral issues anyway, aren't they?
That's correct. And so you're right. I mean, some people on the sexuality issue try to obscure the picture by throwing out, pointed out in your introduction, laws concerning mixture of fabrics or sowing fields with two different types of seed. And those are serving a purpose during the Old Testament time period, again, illustrating the need to keep the Israelites separate from Gentiles that no longer is relevant. So you have to make that case. I mean, and you can't make it, as you say, about the sexuality issue on a number of different levels, including the fact that the New Testament reaffirms the teaching of the Old Testament.
Yes. I might just mention, if people want to go through this book, first of all, at the end of each section, you have attitudes and dispositions. Then you have a number of biblical principles, sometimes going on for an entire page, and then some reflection and questions. So if this is something where you've maybe wanted to teach about this or do a point-counterpoint, it's been a while since we've had Wayne Grudem on, but I noticed you mentioned him and say you guys have some ongoing discussions. So, you got to, matter of fact, I think last time we had him on, it was on his Christian ethics book. But again, that relates to some of these topics. You can kind of hear what some of these really well-educated individuals have had to think about in terms of how to apply some of these biblical principles. And I guess that brings me to a little bit of my frustration. And Tremper, I'm sure you probably have the same. And that is, there are people that have thought deeply about these issues. I think about in the 1970s and 80s, a man that I sometimes had a chance to work with, Carl F.H. Henry, and he was even back then talking about the fact that we sometimes would have people just grab some verse and use this to make their argument on immigration policy, or this verse and use it to argue for national security. And he said, we really need to do the hard work of trying to understand the context, develop principles, and then talk about how those principles apply. Well, believe me, if he was writing about that in the 70s and 80s when I was reading him, now with social media where everything is a meme, everything is a Twitter post, we've got even a bigger issue. And so that's why I certainly wanted to have your book and any other books that to help us think a little more deeply about these issues. Because during especially this campaign 2020, you're going to hear all sorts of one-liners that are just going to probably make your eyes roll, because people aren't thinking as deeply about these issues, and they really need to if we want to be faithful Christians to the text of Scripture and begin to apply those to the everyday world.
Yes, that's right. And that's the reason why I agreed to write the book. Erdman's asked me if I'd write the book and get it out at this time period. And I thought, it's really important for all of us to think through these issues as, particularly as we go into an election year. And I want to emphasize the fact that it does talk about principles. As a matter of fact, when I first started writing the book, that's what I was solely focused on. And then I realized as time went on that the Bible also wants us to develop certain attitudes, and also temper our rhetoric, the way that we talk about issues and other people. And so I introduced that aspect to the book as well. And, I'm not so arrogant as to think I've said the final word on all these things. I don't think the Bible gives us specific public policy. It gives us principles to think through. So people may end up disagreeing with me. My desire, though, is that as they disagree with me, that they find biblical reasons to do so, not just because they don't like the conclusion that I've come to. And just one last comment. I found on a few issues kind of changing my mind as I got into it. So that gave me some hope I wasn't just imposing my own views on the text.
And that is good, because we do have one presidential candidate who has served as mayor who every once in a while seems to come with sort of biblical arguments that always seem to comport with his particular view in the Democratic primary, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. But I need to take a break, and when we come back, I wanted to pick out a couple of issues because you have so many good ones. Religious liberty is something we talk about a great deal, so that kind of gets into kind of the whole church-state issue. Obviously, we'll talk about abortion. I thought, of course, same-sex marriage, racism. We'll see how many we can work our way through. Poverty. These are important issues, and they're going to surface a great deal in the campaign. And so how do we think about those issues from an individual who obviously has been a distinguished scholar and has written quite a bit over the years and provided great commentaries on many of these Old Testament books? So I thought you'd like to know about this new book published by Erdman's, The Bible and the Ballot, Scripture in Political Decisions. Now, I also have a link to Tremper Longman's website, so you can find information there about him, and that is tremperlongman.com, and you can click on the button there and find out a little bit more about all of his books and contact him and various things to read. And, of course, we also have information about the book, which is now coming out. It's in paperback and Kindle. It's got a 2020 copyright, so you should be able to find it soon, but if you want to order it there, it's available on the website, pointofview.net. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a few of those very contentious issues and try to see what are some basic biblical principles to begin to think about how to apply those. And if you would like to join the conversation a little bit later, 1-800-351-1212. As we go to the website today, let me mention that my Viewpoints commentary is there for you today. A video that you might want to watch is one that I posted on Facebook the other day, but it's still available for you to watch just before we move on into the year 2020. It was a little bit of a look back on 2019, and, of course, all sorts of resources on some of these books that we're talking about. Let's take a break, and we'll get back into some of these issues from a biblical point of view right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to know more about Tremper Longman, we have information about him on our website. I would certainly encourage you to go there because this book, as well as many of the other books that he has written, is there. You could also contact him. And if this is something you might want to study in terms of a small group study, something that especially during this year, this kind of the theme that we've had these last 2 hours is the need for discernment. 13 different chapters. The first couple just kind of give you some of the basic principles, and then chapters 4 through 13 really get into those. And obviously, we won't be able to cover all of those, but Tremper, let's, if we can, maybe talk about this broader concept of human dignity, because chapter 7 on abortion, chapter 13 on racism, and really a few of these others get into this. And you talk about, even in the preceding chapters, this idea that we have creation, fall, and then redemption. But we also have the problem of ideology. And so whether it's abortion or maybe even an idolatrous idea that I'm going to treat my race as superior to someone else, there are some great biblical principles we can apply, aren't there?
Yeah, that's right. That's why I dedicated one of the early chapters to talking about these sort of fundamental biblical ideas, like being created in the image of God, which is the foundation of our view that we are dignified as human beings, and also, as you say, on sin and redemption, as well as the very concept of idolatry, which is in essence making anything, whether it's a person or work or a political party, if we put all our hopes in those things rather than God, we're going to be in danger of committing an idolatrous act. And I think that sometimes when we find ourselves being fearful and really anxious about something, rather than putting our trust in God, or we expect some human or human institution to solve our problems, we ought to do kind of a theological check on ourselves.
And I think, as you point out just a minute ago, as you get into these issues, you find you say, well, I've kind of changed my mind on a few of those topics. And a good example is that whenever we talk about, say, abortion, people will quote from Psalm 139 and maybe even Exodus 21 and a few passages like that. But then you take us into some other passages like in Numbers 5, and I'm like, whoa, okay, I've never seen that one used before.
Yeah, right.
So I think there's a sense in which we have to take some time to kind of ferret that out. And so on these issues, you really do help us understand that certainly we do value human life, and all life is valuable, whether at the moment of conception all the way to death, whether of our race or someone else's race. We're all created in his image, one people in his image. So there's a sense in which, as we get into some of these contentious issues like abortion or racism or race relations, whatever, we really need to take our cues from the scripture, not from the culture. And that's one of the reasons I know you wrote this book, so that we would make sure that we were using scriptural principles, not just cultural principles on some of those topics.
Exactly. And I would also throw in religious liberty on that one, too. In my book, I argue there's no presumption for religious liberty in the Old or New Testament, but there's a basis for it in the fact that we're created in the image of God, and we ought to have the freedom of conscience to exercise our religion, and same with other people, too, in societies like the United States, or even their practice of non-religion. My chapter on religious liberty points that out, but also points out that while we should advocate for it, we shouldn't be afraid, if it's threatened, because actually the church can thrive, as the New Testament tells us, even when we don't have religious liberty.
Yeah, look at the church in of China or in Iran right now are good examples of that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, I taught from about 2007 to, well, it was about 2005 to 2012 at the University of Peking. So I was teaching Old Testament in this Marxist, it's the Harvard of China. And most of my students were Christians. And of course, I was told when I went in that I could teach the text, but I couldn't say anything about, my personal beliefs or pray or do anything like that.
Sure.
And what astounded me was how vibrant the church is in China, in spite of this lack of religious liberty. And it reminded me that like at the New Testament time period, God can really grow his church, even under the most threatening circumstances.
Sure. Let me, if I can, maybe focus a lot of our attention on immigration. It's one of your larger chapters. This is a place where, especially as an Old Testament scholar, you can help us out, because the English word we call immigrant or refugee, there are a number of Hebrew words, and I hate to make this sound like we're going to turn this into Hebrew 101, but we're going to have to a little bit for just a minute, because this is important. Once we understand there are a number of terms in the Old Testament related to the topic that is a real contentious topic right now, immigration. Can you kind of teach us through that for a few minutes?
Well, sure. There are different words, though the most relevant Hebrew word is this word ger, which I devote most of my study to. And it's one of the places, again, where I found myself kind of surprised as I really dug deeply into the ger. First of all, it's absolutely amazing, the exhortations to being just and fair and welcoming to the ger. Though, on the other hand, as I point out in my chapter, there's also a good indication that there was border security, in ancient Israel and in the ancient world. When Abraham's going down to Egypt, he's concerned about what they're going to say at the border about it. And so my book gives the details about that. And so I came to think that the ger is probably closest to what we call the documented immigrant rather than the undocumented immigrant. However, again, the whole idea of being created in the image of God gives us strong impetus to have love toward all immigrants, to want to help as many people as we possibly can. That should be our disposition. And in terms of our rhetoric, we certainly should never demonize any type of immigrant. I mean, as a class, sometimes people think of all the people at the border trying to get in are criminals. And certainly there are some, and that's why you need border security. I came away from that, as I said, my book's not about specific public policies, but I came away from my study of that thinking the biggest thing we need right now is for Republicans and Democrats to get together and really hammer out a better immigration system,
for sure,
rather than just trying to demonize both sides.
And one of the things I've said before is sometimes somebody will pull out a verse from the Old Testament, some of the ones I'm thinking of, and then say, well, then that applies to the 21st century. And going, well, be careful now, because some of those individuals also had to agree to the theocracy. They had to abide by the principles. We do not require that of individuals. An individual can come here. If they want to be here legally, of course, they have to agree to be in the United States and affirm the views of the United States, but they don't have to be a Christian. They don't have to be Jewish. They don't have to. And so there isn't a perfect one-to-one correlation. And I think you I think you really threaded the needle pretty well, because on the one hand, we have to show care and compassion and love for any individual, an immigrant, refugee, whether here legally or illegally. But at the same time, you also say that border security is not immoral. The Bible's not calling for open borders, because we do have pointed policies and principles and borders and those kinds of things that we find in Scripture. So I think you've done a really good job of addressing that. So maybe after we take a break, I'd like to maybe at least get into one other issue. And, of course, you have a section on same-sex marriage, because this is a question, Tremper, that a lot of people wonder about. Okay, we didn't have legalized same-sex marriage. We do now. And so obviously, if an individual is going to have a same-sex ceremony, does that mean I'm supposed to go participate in it? How do I think about this from a biblical point of view? What about sexual relations? And a couple of other issues, because that's a very relevant chapter as well. And if you find yourself saying, well, these are contentious issues, I want to read the book, well, that's why we're doing this, because I think you'll find that these 13 chapters really get into this in a lot more detail than even we have a chance to do on a 1-hour program. So let's, if we can, take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation about this book, The Bible and the Ballot, Using Scripture in Political Discussions. We'll talk about this issue of human sexuality right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The book, The Bible and the Ballot, published by Erdman's. You should be looking for it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Let me also commend to you Confronting Old Testament Controversies, another book by Tremper Longman. And again, it's endorsed by Paul Copan. Let me recommend any of Paul Copan's books. Of course, he and Paul Gould were on with us recently talking about their Worldview Bulletin and some other resources, which all are available at our website as well. But really addresses kind of the four big questions coming out of the Old Testament: creation, evolution, history. You know, do we have any evidence of a conquest of the promised land, even before that, in Exodus, those kinds of things? Sexuality, of course, the topic we're going to be addressing right now, and then violence, of course, the so-called Yahweh Wars. So some great material in that book as well. But Tremper, for just a minute, let's talk about this idea of same-sex marriage. Even last hour we talked with Abdu Murray about gender issues and the rest. On the one hand, of course, we want to love all individuals created in the image of God, no matter what a particular sexual sin or sexual activity they're involved with. We should love the person, even if we would disagree with the activity. So the difference between the sin and the sinner, important. But at the same time, how do we think about this? Because we have a whole generation of young people that are saying, well, you know, it's not that big a deal. You know, if two people love themselves, it's really none of my business. But how do we think about this biblically?
Well, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's pretty clear in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that God prohibits same-sex sexual activity, and that's within the broader biblical teaching about sexuality being a gift from God, and that sexual intercourse finds its proper place in that kind of biblically defined marriage. So I think the first thing that we want to work toward is the purity of the church, and not just in the area of homosexual sin, but also in the area of heterosexual sin.
Well said.
I think one thing that unites all of us is that we're broken creatures, and we're all broken in our sexual lives in one way or another. I'm afraid the difference with some is that, when we're confronted by our sexual sin, we don't try to defend it, as sort of God-given, as some same-sex Christian advocates do. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is the most important thing. And I think living in a democratic society like ours, if we're presented with a public policy choice, we want to, for the flourishing of the culture as a whole, support the biblical value. I guess maybe where I'm a little bit maybe different is the idea that we should care but not be hysterical about what the culture is doing.
We shouldn't be surprised when sinners sin. We shouldn't be saying, what a surprise.
We shouldn't. We shouldn't be surprised. I was very influenced by, early on when I was writing my commentary on Daniel back in the 90s, by a quote I came across from the great Welsh preacher of the last generation or two, Martin Lloyd-Jones, who basically says, look, God's first concern isn't that non-Christians act like Christians. God's first concern is that Christians become Christians.
Well said.
And I think we need to ask that question while we're thinking about public policy issues is, are we trying to legislate morality? I came across another great quote that Peter Wehner, who you said you had on recently,
back in October,
quoted in a New York op-ed piece, which basically, where he says essentially the same things. He goes, I wouldn't much like it if, Islamic people try to impose Sharia law on us. So I think there are some interesting issues there. And you're right. I just retired from 20 years of teaching at Westmont College, a wonderful college. I know the scene in Christian colleges across the country. And unfortunately, I think the problem is that the present young generation really wasn't taught well the Bible or theology. And for those of you who are pastors out there who may be listening, really, it's great to have messages that appeal broadly, but also let's get the next generation of young people catechized. I think Tim Keller talks about that.
Sure. I've had Tim Keller on too. Let me just, before we run out of time, talk about how people can use your book. This is one of the reasons I wanted to focus on it as we start this new year. I know in January is a time when there are individuals saying, okay, I'm a small group leader. I kind of like to maybe get into some of these issues. Boy, we're going to have a political campaign. I was wondering if there's something that maybe help us think through and have a discussion about that. Well, this would be one book to think about. 13 different chapters, a couple introductory chapters on the Bible and public policy, and the rest on those controversial issues. And then, as I said, you have a section on attitudes and dispositions, a section and a summary of biblical principles, reflections, and questions, which sometimes go on for 2 pages. So if somebody's a small group teacher, I'm thinking, or maybe a Bible fellowship teacher, maybe even a pastor out there, you're just talking about pastors who want to address some of these issues and say, look, I don't really know that much about criminal justice or immigration or the environment. I know I probably should speak to this, or poverty. Yeah, we'll talk about abortion because it's Sanctity July Sunday. There's a lot of material in there, and it does seem to me that the way you've structured this, individuals can read this, but you seem to have structured this through Erdman's in a way that small group leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, could actually use this in teaching it over a series of weeks.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it'd be wonderful. And thank you so much for promoting the book in this way.
Well, again, I think that what you are addressing, let me just mention some of the other chapters we didn't get into, but we did mention just in passing, there's one on poverty and the environment, and even some issues like war and then capital punishment, criminal justice. These are all hot topics, and it does seem to me that this year, especially, and I just mentioned, you've got Mayor Pete, for example, sometimes using the Bible to come to conclusions that I don't think the Bible comes to. And then let me be fair, let's say there's some people on the right that use the same kinds of attempts to justify their particular policy from a biblical point of view. There's just a real need to have some deeper thinking about these issues. So even if you find yourself coming to a different conclusion than Tremper Longman, which I'm not sure you will, but if you do, at least come up with some explanations for why, because we really are in a time when so much is being won or lost on the basis of a Twitter post or a Facebook meme, and we need to think a lot deeper about those issues, and one of the reasons we wanted to talk about that today here on Point of View. So, Tremper Longman, thank you for being with us. Maybe sometime in the future we can talk about some of those Old Testament controversies, because that's kind of a big issue that our friends, the so-called new atheists, use to beat us over the head with every day. So thank you for writing that book, and thank you for writing this book, The Bible on the Ballot.
Thank you, Kerby. It's been a pleasure. Love to come back and talk about that book.
We probably will do so. Again, if you're not familiar with Tremper Longman, we have a link to his website. I think you're going to find that really helpful. Just scroll down there to his picture. It's tremperlongman.com, and you can find out more about him. And since he's retired, you might even have him come speak at your church or your political group or something like that. So those are some resources that we have available at our website, pointofview.net. Don't forget, I've got a video there you can watch. Of course, you also have the commentary today and a couple of articles, one of which I posted on hate crimes and free speech. So you can find some great material on these books and some other material I've posted for you to read there as well. Tomorrow is our weekend edition. I know Penna Dexter is with me. We've got some other people joining us as well. And I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes. I want to thank Steve for providing those opportunities to pull all of this together. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.